by the lake. Then one of the synagogue rulers, named Jairus, came there. Seeing Jesus, he fell at his feet and pleaded earnestly with him, "My little daughter is dying. Please come and put your hands on her so that she will be healed." So Jesus went with him. A large crowd followed and pressed around him, and a woman was there who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years. She had suffered a great deal under the care of many doctors and had spent all she had. Yet instead of getting better, she got worse. When she heard about Jesus, she came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak, because she thought, "If I just touch his clothes, I will be healed." Immediately, her bleeding stopped, and she felt in her body that she was freed from her suffering. At once, Jesus realized that power had gone from him. He turned around in the crowd and asked, "Who touched my clothes?" "You see the people crowding against you," his disciples answered, "and yet you can ask, 'Who touched me?'" But Jesus kept looking around to see who had done it. Then the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell at his feet, trembling with fear, told him the whole truth. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering." While Jesus was still speaking, some men came from the house of Jairus, the synagogue ruler. "Your daughter is dead," he said. "Why bother the teacher anymore?" Ignoring what they said, Jesus told the synagogue ruler, "Don't be afraid, just believe." He did not let anyone follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. When they came to the house of the synagogue ruler, Jesus saw the commotion, with people crying and wailing loudly. He went in and said to them, "Why all this commotion and wailing? The child is not dead, but asleep." But they laughed at him. After he put them out, he took the child's father and mother and the disciples who were with him and went in where the child was. He took her by the hand and said to her, "Talitha koum," which means, "Little girl, I say to you, get up." Immediately, the girl stood up and walked around. She was 12 years old. At this, they were completely astonished. He gave strict orders not to let anyone know about this and told them to give her something to eat. You may be seated.
We're going through a series on how do you handle things when you can't fix something that's happened to you or someone else. When you have had a bad experience and there's nothing you can do about it. 2 weeks ago, we looked at John the Baptist and how when he went through a really tough time and Jesus didn't come and rescue him, that it didn't mean that God was apathetic, it just wasn't in God's plan. Last week, we looked at Paul's thorn in the flesh. He had some kind of physical ailment, some problem that God never took away from Paul, even though he prayed about it many times, and how you can learn from what you go through. Today, I want to kind of expand on that. In the beginning of this series, I said there are 3 lies that often we tell ourselves when we go through hard stuff. They are, 1, I'll never be happy again. 2, nothing good can come from it. And 3, there's no point in continuing. Today, I want to address the second lie. This idea that when you go through a hard time, nothing good can come from it. You know, I ordered something through Amazon not long ago. It was a light bulb. I have an aquarium and for my fish tank, and written all over the box was a word. You know what that word was? Fragile. And when I opened the box, guess what? It was broke. It was broken. So I wondered if they thought it was like French, like the, Christmas Story movie, Fragile. No. But this idea of fragility is one I want to look at today, and the title of my sermon is Antifragile. Where did I get that? Where there's an author who has wrote a book. His name is Nassim Nicholas Taleb. And in this book, he talks about on a spectrum of fragility, you have things that are really fragile. Think of a teacup. You know, you don't want to shake it. You don't want to mess with it. If you send it in a box, you'd wrap it in plastic, bubbles, tape, and then you think of something that's not really fragile, more like robust. Think of something like a hammer or an axe or something. And think of something that's anti-fragile is different than robust. Anti-fragile is something that when it's affected by a stress, actually becomes more productive. For instance, I have struggles right now with my feet, plantar fasciitis, and I was talking to somebody who, a lot of people have advice for me right now, which is fine, and I listen to it, but one person was telling me, the problem you have is because you wear shoes all the time. I said, well, you from West Virginia? Well, I mean, what? Sorry. I have a lot of good friends from West Virginia. But he said, really, actually, if you go to countries where people don't wear shoes very much, they never get plantar fasciitis. Why? Because it stresses their feet, because they walk without arch support, and guess what it makes? Stronger feet. And we're used to wearing shoes, we're used to wearing supports, and so your feet get weaker and weaker, and that's what I guess has happened to mine. But this idea that you can grow from suffering, and it can make you actually stronger than if you never went through suffering. It is one of the major themes in the Bible. It's a great truth. And I want to talk about that truth today and what it means for us. I was watching the Olympics. Any of y'all watch the Olympics? Did you watch the opening ceremonies? It was really kind of weird because you had all these people walking into the stadium and there was nobody in the stadium. And they're all wearing masks, so it looked unusual. But the thing that I remembered about it, that I took away from it, was the big opening ceremony. The end of it, they sang this song by the Beatles called Imagine. Famous song, Imagine. And the thing that hit me about it was how it was endemic of the secular world we have become. The words, the first line to this song that everybody was singing in the stadium was, imagine there's no heaven. It's easy if you try. No hell below us, above us only sky. Imagine all the people living for today. Imagine there's no countries. It isn't hard to do, nothing to kill or die for, and no religion too. And this is the secular world which we're becoming. And it's sad. And it's gotten where we don't even notice it. I want to talk about how Christianity has so many more resources for dealing with pain and suffering than the secular world we live in. Now, you would expect a Christian preacher to say this, but I really believe it's true, and I want to look at it. Let's look at the example of this little girl and how that plays out. Or this text. First, we have the little girl who's acutely ill. She is on death's door. That's a kind of suffering. It is a terrible thing to see a child go through. Second person that's hurting is the woman who's chronically ill. She has an ongoing illness that's lasted for, 12 years. In fact, it says that she's gone to many doctors, and the doctors, instead of helping her, they took her money, and she became worse. Do you know they come up with a word for that? It's called iatrogenic. Isn't it scary that they have a word? They needed a word for that. A time when doctors actually make you worse. And so she has this illness, she has this anger she has toward doctors, so that's a second type of suffering. The third kind of suffering, which sometimes we forget, but it is absolute terrible kind of suffering. It's the suffering of the girl's father. His little girl is sick, and she's dying, and he cannot help her. And there's a powerlessness that is smothering to him. And it is really tough to go through. And so these are three types of suffering: the little girl, the woman, and the father. And in our lives today, there are some of us right now who are in those categories. And if you're not, you know somebody who is. It is inevitable. Suffering is out there. How do you handle it when you go through these kinds of suffering events? Now, if you turn to the secular worldview, which it seemed like we did in the Olympic moment there, the secular worldview is this: there is no God. Everything is by natural causes. There's no transcendent. There's no supernatural. There's certainly no life after death. And so everything in this world that's important happens to us in real time. And so if you want to be successful, you need to have that success financially or romantically, or it's something that happens to you and that makes you successful, because everything that counts is in this life. That's the secular viewpoint. It is bankrupt. It has been bankrupt for as long as it's existed. It was bankrupt in the Roman times. It is today. There were two little books that were very powerful books. One was by Viktor Frankl. It was called Man's Search for Meaning. He wrote it because he had been in Auschwitz, and he became a psychologist, and he wrote this of experience as a diary of how people reacted to the terrible suffering he experienced there. Another person, Langdon Gilkey, wrote another book about his experience in a Japanese concentration camp or an internment camp. And both of them noticed the same thing. With people of faith, they handled the suffering much different than people with no faith. People who didn't believe in God, they either went one of two directions when they went through this terrible suffering. They either became evil and more evil, or they shriveled up and basically they disintegrated and died. That's how they handled suffering. And we live in a world today that is turning toward this secular viewpoint to get strength, and there's no strength to be found there. Paul Brand was a pioneering orthopedic surgeon, and he was British, but he spent a lot of his career in India. And in India, he spent most of his medical career, but at the end of it, he spent it in the United States. And he wrote about that experience and how different was his experience treating sick people in India versus sick people in America. By the way, I talked this over with Manny, and he told me it was true as well, one of our church members from India. And Paul Brand discovered that patients who lived in America were in far greater comfort and far greater safety than anybody he treated in India, and yet they were less equipped to handle suffering and far more traumatized by it and asked for far more pain medicine. And he believed that this culture that our country, America, has come to, this secular culture, he says, the reigning metaphor of the contemporary secular view is that suffering is just chance misfortune, and the sufferer is a victim under attack from impersonal forces devoid of intentionality, and that means it has no point. That's the secular point of view. Whereas he found Christians, they understood that God was in control behind the scenes, and there was a point to it. There was another woman, Larcia McFarr, and she was a writer. She wrote many books on this, or one book on it, and she talks about her experience interviewing people who worked in the healthcare industry in very dangerous situations, usually nurses and doctors who went into third world places where there is violence and death. And she said all these people who did this, by the way, were people of faith, predominantly Christian. She said, I never interviewed one atheist who did that for a living. Can you believe that? And she said, there's this commonality to them. They saw that suffering was a part of life, not something that you should be immune to. They also thought that God was in control, and that was core to who they were. And so as we begin to look at this today, I want you to think about that. Do you believe that way? Do you believe that God is in control? Do you have that in core in your life? And do you believe that maybe you don't understand why this is happening, but there is a purpose? That's what these folks did. I want to look at three things today that I think Christianity points us toward that is opposite of the way that secular culture points us toward. First off, Christianity pioneered an enabling of grief that didn't destroy you. This goes all the way back to the first century. Before Jesus, there was this belief system that the Greeks used, and they believed that everything that was important was in this current life. And so their mindset was that you needed to be stoic. You know what stoic is? Stoic is basically having a stiff upper lip. And if you go through a hard time, you never cry, you never show your emotions, and we inherit that mindset somewhat, and I've heard it before. I've heard people say that there's somebody at a funeral or something, and they're crying really hard, and they said, how are they doing? I said, well, they're doing pretty bad. They've pretty broken up. Nothing wrong with crying. And that expression of grief is part of what we need to go through. And Christianity had never taught that crying and showing grief is wrong. In fact, there was this guy that wrote this book, B.B. Warfield. He was a biblical scholar, and he wrote a book called The Emotional Life of Our Lord. And what he did is he took the four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and he went through all the Gospels, and he underlined and studied every time it showed Jesus having an emotion. And guess what the predominant emotion was of Jesus over the four Gospels? He was a man of what? Sorrows and acquainted with grief. Jesus was not a stoic personality. He was not a person that didn't experience sadness and grieving. And he was always moved with compassion, which is a form of grief. And so this was completely opposite of the way the Roman pagan world in that time period believed. And within a few hundred years, that Roman mindset failed. And the whole area, that same area of the Roman Empire became more of a Christian empire, at least in name. And so what was it about Christianity that was so different from the secular mindset? And three things this guy talks about that were different was, one, a God who suffers. No other religion in the world has this. A God who actually suffers for us. Jesus Christ became human being, and he felt suffering, and he went through suffering for us. And that's a big deal, that we have a God who understands how we feel. It's just not someone who's never gone through it. He understands what suffering is like. Second, in Christianity, when you die, you still stay yourself. That's a big deal. Unlike some religions that believe in reincarnation, that you come back as a different person or something like that, but you don't have your same mind. We believe that when you die, you keep your consciousness, that it's still you, and you have a resurrected body, that you have a new body. Thank the Lord, you don't have the same one you got now. And I'm praying, that mine will be really good, Restored to newness, that you have a new body, that it's still you. And those great truths, I hope you have embedded in your heart and in your mind. And it helps you to see the world in a different way. And so unlike a lot of the shame and honor religions that turn their backs on grieving, Christianity doesn't do that, because Christianity believes that God has suffered, that you have personal, you become a complete person after you die, and you are resurrected. Second big thing that is different than the culture today is Christianity teaches that suffering is quite often disproportionate and unjust. We live in a world today that says basically life should always be fair. Guess what? It's not. And the Bible never teaches that. In fact, remember the book of Job? The book of Job, Job has not really done anything to deserve the suffering he gets, and he goes through a terrific suffering, and he has 3 buddies. I had to look up their names because I can't remember them. Bildad, Eliphaz, and Zophar. And these 3 buddies come alongside him and they said, well, what did you do? You ever had somebody say that to you? Well, what did you do? And he said, I didn't do nothing. And they said, well, you must have done something. And so you go through the whole book of Job, and they never change. And at the end of the book of Job, God is angry with those 3 because they continue to harbor this belief system that says there should never, ever be anything unjust. But guess what? We live in a broken world. When did it get broken? In the Garden of Eden. Adam and Eve chose evil. God did not make cancer. It is a result of the fallen nature of humankind, of decisions that have been made before us that we have inherited through being human beings. This brokenness of the world is there. God did not intend it to be broken, but because of choices that were made, there is this broken world that we live in. And Christianity acknowledges that, but it doesn't stay there. Christianity in James 1:2 says, consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of many kinds, because you will. You're going to face all kinds of trials. We looked at 3 here, the little girl, the woman, and the father, all of them facing different kinds of trials. Maybe right now you're facing different kinds of trials. Guess what? That's part of life. If you want to get through life never going through anything bad, good luck with that. It's not going to happen. And somewhere along the way, as Americans, we forgot that. What the Bible teaches is that the rain falls on everybody, that we all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God, and sometimes you're going to have bad things happen. But the third thing that I want to point out that's different from what secular culture teaches is that Christianity teaches that sufferings are never pointless. Yes, bad things are going to happen, but there is a plan. You don't know the plan, but there is a plan. I'm going camping in a couple of weeks, and we unfortunately still do tent camping. And if you were tent camping and somebody asked you if there was a St. Bernard in your tent, you would look. And by the way, if you go tent camping with a St. Bernard, I'll pray for you. That's not a good idea. But you could see it. But if you are going camping and you're getting bug bites, and you know what no-see-ums are? You can't see them. They're little bitty bugs. And somebody said, are there any no-see-ums in the tent? Well, you'd look in there, but you wouldn't see them. Why? Because there are no-see-ums. Your eyes aren't good enough. 99% of the time, you are not going to know why bad things happen. You are not going to know why something terrible happened to you or someone that you love or something happened to those around you. And you're going to think, why does that happen? Does that mean that there's no reason for it? No, it doesn't. It just means that you're not able to know. This father did not know it. Romans 5:3-4 says this, not only so, but we also glory in our sufferings because we know that suffering produces perseverance, character, and character, hope. Maybe so, but this guy didn't know it at the time. Now, I want to think about this story for just a minute. This girl is acutely ill. She's going to die, and she's dying, and Jesus is on a way with the Father to go see her, and on the way, this other chronically ill woman who's been sick for 12 years and is upset, but she'll last another day. But she comes to Jesus, and Jesus stops and talks to her. Well, the father's thinking, why? Why are you doing this? We got to go. But Jesus knows. He knows that his plan is that she is going to die and be resurrected, and there'll be more joy than ever before in her life. He also knows that this woman who touched him needs him to talk to her. She needs him to come and say something and acknowledge what's gone on. Father didn't know that. Disciples didn't know that. Jesus knew it. And so Jesus says, who touched me? And she said, well, I did. And he looks at her and he says, daughter, your faith has made you well. And he touches her. And I think not only does he heal her physically, he heals her emotionally and spiritually. He takes the time, even though most people would not have taken the time and would have been upset that he stopped. And then Jesus goes on to the little girl, and he tells everybody, well, she's asleep. Well, according to Luke, her spirit had left her, so she was dead. And yet, he goes to take her hand, and he says this word in Aramaic, which is another example that we know the Bible was eyewitness, because how would you know it was Aramaic if you weren't there? And he says in Aramaic, Talitha cum. Cum means rise up. Talitha means little girl, but it's more a personal word. It's like Jesus says to her, sweetheart, get up. And he takes her hand. And he pulls her up out of death. What a miracle. He says, sweetheart, get up. Same thing that maybe a mom would say to a little girl getting up on a sunny morning. Honey, get up. Now, the father didn't understand. He didn't understand before that moment why Jesus had delayed. He didn't understand why things were happening. He was upset about it. In your life and my life, there are going to be days where we don't understand what's going on. It doesn't make sense to us. The answer is not because God doesn't love us. The answer is because God doesn't want us to know. And it's a mystery. And so how do you become anti-fragile? Called faith. Called believing in faith. And I know that some of you have lost things, and I have lost things, that if it makes me stronger, that's great, but I wish I had those things back. But the truth is, if we live forever, then even death is just a nice night's sleep. You know, even death is just a nice night's sleep. And so the loved one that you miss, you'll be with again. That's what the Bible teaches. Sharon and I have been very tender over the last few days because 2 Summer Olympics ago was when Mark got sick, our 12-year-old that passed away from cancer. And when we get to these events in our lives, sometimes we don't even expect it to happen, but something happens and it reminds you of what would happen and what you lost. I remember asking Mark when he was a little boy, what we were watching the Olympics, what his favorite sport was. You know what his favorite sport was? Push me in the swings. And you know, if I let myself, I could grieve and lose myself in that grief and that challenging God, asking why, and it would be a spiral down, down, down. And if I didn't have faith in God, that's what the secular mindset would give me. There would be no meaning and no truth. But because of the love of God, and He sent His Son to give us strength and hope, death is just a nice night's sleep. And one day we'll be reunited with our loved ones in heaven. That's the promise And as we go through this process of life, of losing things and gaining things, remember that God's plan is behind it all. And he wants us not just to endure it, but to shape us and mold us into the person that he wants us to be. And I pray that that happens and that we could be alongside each other as we go through this sometimes very difficult process. Thank God for the hope we have in Jesus Christ. Would you pray with me? Our Heavenly Father, there are many here today who are still tender over their loss. And some are tender because of what they're going through right now. Lord, I pray that you would remind us that we don't know it all, that you do love us. And I pray that we turn our hearts and our souls over to you. Lord, we acknowledge that you are the God of the universe, and that we are not wise enough to understand why things happen. But we trust that you have a plan, and we live in the middle of it. Forgive us for our lack of trust. Help us to be the people you're calling us to be. In Jesus Christ's strong name we pray. And all God's people said.